Celts and Their Crafts, a study by the fourth year General Studies Group at Hightown School, produced, directed and originated by R.S. Miles. A Celtic community had been attacked by a band of roaming Anglo-Saxons and were forced to seek a new site to rebuild their home. They arrived at Thornhill in the early spring of the year 200 BC. Their first task was to set about building a house. The Celts knew how to build several types of houses, but it depended on the local conditions which type they would build. We decided on a round house with wattle and daub walls and a thatched roof. We had a small grove of trees nearby and a plentiful supply of reeds from the Hamble River. Sometimes houses were built over holes in the ground, but we couldn't do this because the area is a clay bed and any hole would soon fill with water. The Celtic house is always built to the same design. It is the result of much thought and practical experience. First of all, the circle is marked out, and the four centre poles set up and braced. The outer ring of uprights, which form the walls, are put in position and linked around the top to hold them together. And the tops of every one of the outer posts are then joined to the four centre poles by long straight branches. This forms the ceiling of the room and the floor of the upper room. The pattern, which has been made in the ground by the post holes, is exactly like the pattern formed by the stones at Stonehenge and Avebury Ring, and several other ancient places of worship. One wonders if this coincidence leads to a connection between the home and the temple. The early morning mists were still hanging in the trees when we started to cut the reeds for the roof thatch. The reeds had stood all winter and had lost their flags of leaves, and thanks to the fine spring weather, they were well dried out and ready for our purpose. The Celts of the period we are studying, which is the early Iron Age, would probably be using a bronze reaping knife, and would have considered our steel one to be a real luxury. Bronze knives were made by casting the shape in a clay mould and by hammering the edge with a stone mallet. It could be given a very sharp, hard edge. No bronze, however, could hope to hold a cutting edge as long as our steel reaping hook, and a bronze smith would have been kept very busy, sharpening the knives of the reapers. We forged and shaped our own hooks in the workshop and made the wooden handles which were bound on with wire. The house roof timbers had been raised, and at the very top placed the sign of the bush, an ancient symbol for hospitality. It is also a talisman against evil spirits getting into the roof before the thatch is complete. We are lucky having such long, strong reeds to use for the thatch. The alternative is straw, which must have been commonly used by the Celts who lived away from the sea. This is another example of local materials dictating the style of building. Straw, being much shorter and thinner, would have required many more overlapping layers to bring them to the top. As it is with the reeds, we needed only 4 courses, and were able to make swift progress. The method we decided on was to lay a thin stick over the bundles of reeds and sew it to the frame of the roof with a coarse string on a wooden needle. As you can see, it's a very effective technique. Of course, the real art of the modern thatcher is not only to lay a weatherproof roof, but to achieve that beautiful smooth finish with which we are all familiar. This craft has been developed over the centuries, but it is interesting that even as beginners, our thatch would have been quite effective. It has been mentioned before that our school is built on a clay bed, so it is natural that we should dig the clay for use in making pottery. We made pottery bowls which could be used to serve stew in. The walls of the roundhouse are filled in by a technique called wattle and daub, where the wattle is an interwoven panel of thin sticks which supports the daub, a mixture of mud and manure. The manure acts as a cement to hold the mud together when it dries. Wattle and daub walls had one serious drawback. When the wood inside had become dry, the whole wall became a torch only waiting for a light. In less fertile parts of the country, where there were few trees but many stones, the walls were made of stones. The fascinating thing is that even with stone, the basic design of the house remained the same, completely round, with walls like spokes radiating from the centre. These were known as wheel houses. It's a pity we were never to be given a chance to complete our round house, because on the last day of term, before the Easter holiday, the dreaded Anglo-Saxons attacked again and burned all our work beyond repair. We were very unhappy to see our roundhouse ruined, and it was with despair that we set about dismantling the structure it had taken so long to build. However, from evil it often happens that some good can come. In our case, it gave us the chance to build another style of dwelling using the same timber. This time we decided to have a rectangular house with a turf roof, which would have been more difficult to burn. The weather during the Easter holiday was wonderful sunshine and ideal for fitting out boats and building houses. The roundhouse was burned on Friday, the last day of term, and the new turf house was started on Monday, the first day of the holiday. And by the evening we had measured out the frames and even had them set up. In 200 BC, the Celts favoured a communal style of living, and several families lived in the same house. Each man would have his own sleeping space, partitioned off by a thin wall of skins and wattle, and in this space his faction or family would sleep. The centre of the house was for communal use, cooking, eating and entertainments which could be shared by everybody. The roundhouse is ideal for this arrangement, because with the fire in the centre and the sleeping cabins radiating around the walls, everyone could have an equal share of warmth. In the rectangular house, however, if the fire is in the centre and the corners are cold, and if the fire is at one end, which would allow the smoke to go out through a hole left at the top of the end wall, then the other end of the house is almost without heat. This situation would give rise to the headman being placed at the warm end, and the most lowly to be sleeping near the door. Sleeping in a room projecting over the threshold would be the watchman. He was a man of some importance, being responsible for the coming and going of all persons in the house. He features prominently in the narrative poems which form the basis of the knowledge we have of the time. By studying pieces of Celtic metalwork during a field study trip to the British Museum, we were able to identify the techniques used to make them. And then, by using the same techniques, we could feel that our reproductions were very close to the original. Here you see a copper shield being chased, using a tool like a blunt chisel to decorate the surface of the shield. Another technique called repousse had already been used to raise the pattern by working on the reverse side. The upright legs for the looms were made by the boys, and the Y-shaped supports for the heddle rod fitted into place. Celts were proud and much preoccupied with their personal appearance. The men wore loose-fitting trousers and tunics belted at the waist and a long cloak for the cold seasons. Women wore a long straight dress, again belted at the waist, and became famous for the beauty of their cloaks. Almost all Celtic houses had a loom upon which the ladies would weave the cloth from sheep's wool or flax. The type of loom they used is called a warp-weighted loom, which means that the long threads which form the length of the cloth were hung from a crossbar with weights at the bottom to keep them under tension whilst the weft was woven into them. The weights were made with clay fired in an open fire. We visited a local brickyard where the clay they are digging is about 20 million years old, and as they were digging down to this level, a Celtic camp was discovered and some quite interesting relics found. We were given some of the blue clay to make our loom weights, which we then fired in an open fire. It's interesting to note that after the firing, the clay turns red, just like a red brick. We used the open fire method of firing because this is the method the Celts would have used. It's astonishing how much wood was needed to keep a good fire going for 3 hours. This loom is semi-automatic and consists of a headstick from which the warp is hung. And just above the weights, another stick joins the two uprights. This is called the shed stick and divides the warp into alternate threads, one forward and one behind. The heddle rod rests on the Y-shaped supports, and by moving it forward and back, the warp is opened in alternate directions for the shuttle to pass through. From these looms came the original Celtic tartan, when each woman in her own village would weave the cloth exactly the same each time, and therefore the cloth could be identified as being from that area. Forge work played an important part in Celtic life, because when iron is red hot, it's relatively soft and can be hammered into the required shape. This process, making the decorative balls on the ends of the fire dog's ears, is called upsetting. The iron fire dog was then the latest thing in cooking equipment. It provided a clean way of cooking meat and a convenient rack for hanging other kitchen tools on. Smelting tin from the ore, as the Celts must have done it, would involve many hours of work on the hand bellows. We made an electric blower in the workshop, which, although it was cheating, allowed us to reach smelting temperatures of 1200 degrees centigrade inside the limits of the time available. A mould for casting tin medals was made from aluminium on the lathe, and the medal was to commemorate the visits we had made to Cornwall collecting the ore and other materials. On one side is the school badge, and on the other the words Cornish Tin. The making of metal was a science brought to this country by the Celts, who introduced the first bronze weapons and tools by importing them from the continent. The discovery of rich deposits of copper and tin ores soon brought the knowledge of how to extract the metal from the rock. We have reproduced the type of smelting pit then used, and although the hand bellows would have been made from animal skin and the crucibles made from clay, the ingredients of the smelt would be exactly similar to ours. The tin ore, or cassiterite, the fluorite, the white mineral which acts as a flux to prevent the tin from oxidizing, and charcoal, which provides the heat. Fluorite is a mineral commonly found in quantity in the same areas as tin and copper ores. The craft of making things with the bronze, an alloy of tin and copper, was limited to casting and forging because they had no harder metal to cut it with. The moulds for casting were made with clay, and after wooden or fired clay patterns had been made, impressions were taken with a soft clay to make the mould, which was then fired. It is possible to include quite intricate detail using this technique, and the works which have been identified as Celtic show that they made full use of this medium. There may be some doubt as to whether the ancient Celts actually used a lathe which made use of a return spring, But there's little doubt that some means of turning was used, and next to a bow-driven lathe, this is the most simple. It's highly improbable, however, that it was used to cut wood as we are doing. There is evidence to suggest that some form of soft shale was used to turn shale bracelets, which would have been highly decorative and so in keeping with the Celtic character. And although the pole lathe has been in use for many hundreds of years, it is still in commercial use today in parts of Wales. The cauldron, which started life as a copper wash boiler, was nickel-plated by the science department to comply with our modern standards of hygiene. On the evening of July the 21st, the longest day, we held a Noson Lawen, a Celtic term meaning happy night. Members of the school staff and parents of the children involved were invited to take part in a display of our activities and to taste a Celtic stew which we made using ingredients the Celts would have had available at their time. Cakes of unleavened bread, a spit roasted leg of lamb, and a chicken roasted in the fire, wrapped in a ball of clay, were all served to the guests, and all were voted to be delicious, and brought our exciting look into Celtic life to a successful end.